Alrighty, so what we want to accomplish with this set of slides is an exploration of the three broad principles that underpin any constitutional democracy. All right, so as our authors note, look, each constitutional democracy in the world today does things a little bit differently from every other one. All right, each one has its own unique special formula for how you do constitutional democracy. Let's take our mother country, right, Great Britain. They have a parliamentary system, and they have a prime minister, and they have a royalty and all of that, right? And they have a high court, but it doesn't have anywhere near the power as our Supreme Court. We don't have a parliamentary system, right? We have relatively co-equal branches at the federal level: executive, legislative, and judicial. And we don't have a prime minister, right? We have a president. We don't have royalty, and we have a Supreme Court with a great deal of power, right? So both the U.S. and Great Britain, right, are constitutional democracies, but each one does it a little bit differently. That's cool, right? So you're always going to find that with any constitutional democracy. Each one's a bit unique unto itself. But, our authors argue, across all constitutional democracies in the world today, three basic principles are common to all of them. All right, and that is the rule of law, natural law, and natural rights. And in the slides to come here, we'll dive into each one of those principles and give examples. The first principle that underpins all constitutional democracies across the globe today, number one, the rule of law. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? That's the idea that in a constitutional democracy, everyone is held to the law, right? Whether that's the U.S. Constitution, whether that's federal law, whether it's state law, whether it's local ordinances, right? We're all held, that would be, government officials, right? Private citizens, corporations, labor unions, top to bottom, high to low, and everything in between, right? We're all held to the rule of law. This is a way, right, it turns out, to limit and put boundaries on the exercise of power, right? That creates space for liberty and freedom for we the people. Now look, right? We aspire to this. We aspire to this idea that all are held to the rules of the game, right? We're all governed by the rule of law. No one's above the law. No one's beneath the law. And the law applies across the board equally to everyone and everything. That's an aspiration, people. That's an aspiration, right? You can't achieve that in practice perfectly. Not at all, right? Not to harp on Donald Trump, right? But there's actually two ways to argue this, right? Some would say, look, that guy's gotten away with crazy stuff for decades, and now it's, catching up to him a little bit. Right? But, historically, you would say he's quite powerful, quite affluent, and able to sort of, wiggle his way out of all sorts of legal dilemmas in ways that most of us could not. could not, right? And that's just one example, right? There's tons, just generally, right? If you have a lot of money and power in America, and let's say celebrity, right? You're going to be pretty well insulated in some ways from the rule of law. You can get away with stuff, right, that most of us cannot get away with. That's just a fact, right? That's just a fact. We all recognize that. One has to be both ideal and principled, right? Rule of law applies to all, but also pragmatic. Yeah, but in practice, we're just going to come up short. Doesn't mean that we don't try to continue to move in the direction, right, of making it universally applicable and apply equally to all. But we also have to acknowledge, right, there's going to be shortcomings. Of course there are. Right, so some would say that about Donald Trump. He's the epitome of somebody with celebrity and power and money that's gotten away with stuff, right, that most of us could never get away with. Others say, no, he's being targeted because he's affluent, because he's a celebrity, and he's being held to higher legal standards than the rest of us. He's below the law in a way, right, instead of above it. You could certainly argue that. I'm not sure I find that terribly persuasive, but you could certainly argue that. Right? He's being uniquely targeted because of who he is, that he's beneath the law. But either way, right? Either way you argue that, you would say, yeah, you can sort of see, right, that there are some deformations of this principle of the rule of law applicable across the board, high to low, in between, no one above, no one beneath the law. Look, it's not always going to be that way in practice. It's not. I think here about O.J. Simpson, right? Commits, near as we can tell, and I think to a certainty, quite honestly, a brutal double murder, right? And he gets away with it in criminal court, right? He hires the dream team. They stretch that litigation out over like a year, right? And he gets away with it. Look, most of us couldn't have afforded the dream team to do that, right? Most of us would have been found guilty given the evidence, man. Wouldn't have had a chance. Which you should be found guilty when you commit a heinous double murder, right? But he had the resources, right, and the celebrity to essentially hire very elite legal guns to get him out of his predicament. So that's just the fact. But, right, that doesn't mean that we don't continue to focus on getting as close as we can to the principle of the rule of law, which is critical to any functioning constitutional democracy. A second principle common to all constitutional democracies is the principle of natural law. This is the idea that the government and its laws are held to a higher standard, the standard of natural law. This is a way to limit the power of the government, right? Put boundaries on it, restrictions, limits, and empower we the people to hold government to account, right? And the best example I can think of is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, right? And the Black Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. They challenged Jim Crow laws across the South, right? Laws that deprived black people of access to the ballot. That mandated segregated public facilities, miscegenation laws that banned interracial marriage, right? And the movement, and Dr. King argued, look, those are definitely statutes, those are definitely laws at the state and local level across the South, but they conflict with natural law, right? The law of God, as King put it, because he was a man of the cloth, the law of God is, right, that everybody's equal in the eyes of our Creator, and that racial discrimination violates that fundamental belief that racial discrimination is illegitimate, is inconsistent with natural law, right? So natural law can be a great way to challenge governmental authority, right? It's really the whole basis, isn't it, for civil disobedience, right? That was Henry David Thoreau's argument back in the mid-19th century, right? That the institution of slavery, the Mexican-American War, the intertwining of church and state, these were three things that he thought, yeah, these are definitely sort of laws and practices of the government, but they're not legitimate, right? They violate natural law. So natural law is a great way to challenge governmental authority. Now you could imagine, right? It's often sort of a hazy concept of what exactly is natural law, and that can be tricky, right? Because you might say, well, natural law tells me that Biden was not elected. That violates the law of God, and he needs to be overthrown to bring the practice of politics in line with natural law as I understand it, right? So it can get sketchy. But generally, right, it's a super valuable thing in any constitutional democracy because it's a way to limit the power of the government, challenge the government, right, and hold it to account when it misbehaves. Although, again, right, what exactly constitutes misbehavior can be a little bit subjective, a little bit eye of the beholder. The third fundamental principle that spans, right, all constitutional democracy, because we've talked about the rule of law, we've talked about natural law, and now we're going to talk about natural rights briefly. Natural rights really derive, right, they're like a subset of natural law, but they have a little different focus, right? This is the idea that we, the people, individuals, here I'm going to steal from Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, right, that we, the people, are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right, that we, and this is critical, people, we possess these fundamental rights, right? Not because the government creates them and gives them to us. No, sir, right? We're given these rights by our Creator, right? Basically, once we're born, right? Once we are born, we immediately have these rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And then government's job is to protect those against infringements, either infringement from the national government, state governments, or local governments. Right? So it puts we the people in charge, right? And the obligation is on the government to recognize and protect these fundamental rights. Here we would say, right, they're encoded in law in the Bill of Rights. The right to keep and bear arms, the right to free speech, to exercise the religion of our choice, freedom from cruel and unusual punishments, right? Freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, these sorts of things. Now, we should also say, right, who's the OG on this? The OG is John Locke, right, writing in about the year 1700, one of those Enlightenment thinkers that influenced the Founding Fathers, like Jefferson. And Jefferson cribbed pretty hard from Locke, right, because Locke said about, about 80 or 90 years before Jefferson that we are endowed by our Creator with the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Right, Locke was all about property rights. So Jefferson, right, takes that and tweaks it a little to make it more universally applicable, especially at a time when most Americans didn't own property. So he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right, which includes all of us. Well, that's a little bit complicated. We'll get to that soon enough in a subsequent chapter. And this concept, right, of natural rights is powerful. I can't even sort of communicate how powerful it is. It's a very big deal, right? It's a way to empower we the people against the government and to put on the shoulders of the government, right, the obligation not to create these rights and give them to us. They don't have that power, people. They do not have that power under this principle, right? We acquire these rights once we're born, and then it's the job of the government to define them in law and then enforce them. And it turns out, right, as John Locke and Jefferson are going to argue in the next chapter, if government fails to do that adequately, we acquire the right to rebellion, right? If government doesn't do its damn job, we the people then have the right to overthrow that government and replace it with a government that will perform that duty to protect our fundamental natural rights.